This is really quite an honor. I'm always blown away by the interest that these programs garner, and I thank you and Ari and Shirel and all the other members of the CSP team for inviting me to participate and to present today. As I say, I love audiences that are interested in Judaica and that want to learn more about their heritage, and this is really a wonderful opportunity and medium for us to learn together. So thank you very much for that. With your permission, I'm going to share my screen. If you bear with me for a moment. Okay, is everyone seeing a PowerPoint presentation? Hopefully everyone is seeing. Okay, so I'm going to start now the presentation. And we will begin. So as you can see, today we're going to be discussing, as Gila mentioned, this mahzor, this holiday prayer book that has been named the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. I thank Ari Katz for having given the title of this talk, The Journey of a Treasure. We are going to be talking about this book's journey. But before we get to the journey, I want to give you a little bit of background on what this book is and what it represents about the religious culture of Ashkenazi Jewry during the High Middle Ages and later Middle Ages as well. So let us begin that journey. So some of you may know that in the Middle Ages, Jewish communities generally did not have access to lots of books. The production of books was an expensive proposition. It involved hiring a scribe, a professional who would be able to produce or reproduce the text of, say, the prayers or the Bible or perhaps a legal work exactingly in the way that it was meant to be transmitted. And because of that, many Jewish communities could not afford to have prayer books for all of their congregants. Generally speaking, this meant that the prayer leader or chazan would have in front of him a large volume with all of the prayers written out exactly as the community custom dictated. And he would lead the prayer service out loud, and the congregation would listen along. If they knew some of the prayers, they might recite them along with him. But generally speaking, very few members of the congregation had their own books in front of them. What you have on this screen, on this slide, is actually on the left side of the slide. You can see a facsimile edition of a very famous mahzor. It's called the Worms Mahzor. It is now at the National Library of Israel. You can see the shelf mark is MS Hebrew, Quarto 781. Volume 1 of 2 of that mahzor was created in Würzburg. It's actually localized and dated to 1272. And it contains the prayers for the fall holidays, what we might call Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah through Simchat Torah. So think of the prayers of the high holidays as well as Sukkot. Sorry, excuse me, I'm mixing up. That volume 1, excuse me, has the prayers for the winter, spring, and summer holidays. The second volume is the one with the fall holidays. So what we're looking at here is actually the beginning of the piyut, the liturgical poem that's recited on the first day of Pesach, the first day of Passover, when we pray for dew. Some of you may recall from the synagogue that up until Pesach, Jewish law requires that we pray for rain, but then with the onset of Passover, we switch over to praying for dew. So in that poem, the very first word of that poem is bida'ato, and it goes on to say abi achidot, be'am zulazut lahachadot, etc. You can see if you're looking closely at the letters, this is actually an inscription in Yiddish. This is the very first, the very earliest inscription that we have in Yiddish. Of a full Yiddish sentence. We have individual words and names from earlier periods, but if we're talking about a full Yiddish sentence, this is the earliest such sentence, and it occurs in this word, bidato. If you look closely, you can see, I wrote it out for you, that the scribe, or maybe someone later, probably the scribe though, wrote a blessing for the person who brings the mahzor to the synagogue for the services. It says, Gut Tag im Betag, sever dis mahzor in Beis HaKnesses Tag. Okay, so, and the translation is on the bottom, may a good day shine for him who carries this mahzor to the synagogue. Now, why would you need a blessing for the person who carries the mahzor, this holiday prayer book, to the synagogue? Because you can see it's a rather large book, right? I reproduced the facsimile on the left side of the slide for you intentionally so that you could get a sense of how big a book this is. This Worms Mahzor, and there are 2 volumes actually, right? Obviously, for this purpose, you would only need to take one to the synagogue, but it's something that would have been kept in a private person's home and stored there for safety, and then brought to the synagogue for the services. So this is to give you a sense of how much had been invested in the creation of these mahzorim that were supposed to contain all of the prayers that the community recited, and also the size, the scale of these books. I'm going to show you now the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. As you can see over here on this slide, I reproduced images of the binding. It's a relatively simple sort of ivory colored Morocco binding with clasps, but this is a pretty big book, right? On the very far right of the screen, you can see that it has the width of a human hand approximately. And I don't remember off the top of my head how much it weighs, but it's about a foot long. Okay, so a rather large book indeed. Who wrote this book? So we don't have the full name of the scribe who created the book, but we do have many, many hints throughout the volume that he must have been someone named Abraham. As you can see on this slide, there are several instances of the name Abraham that occur throughout the liturgy, both on the high holidays and in general. Generally speaking, we're talking about the patriarch Abraham, right? Or I should say, I think almost exclusively, we're talking about the patriarch Abraham. He is the person referenced in these prayers. And not every single time, but many, many times when the name Abraham occurs in the text, the scribe decorated that name with either a crown, as you can see on the right side, or these sort of feathery, wing-like images on the left side of the screen. He's trying to telegraph to you, the reader or the prayer leader, that he is indeed the person responsible for this book. Unfortunately, we don't know very much more about him. We don't have, for example, his father's name. We don't know where he was from. We don't even know where he was working. We do have a good guess that he was probably working in southern Germany. The reason being, and this is where I'm headed now, we have both paleographic as well as catalogical evidence that this book was probably created in southern Germany. Paleography refers to old handwriting, that is to say, books or other documents that are produced by hand. The study of the script in which those books are produced or those documents are produced is called paleography. We know that different Jewish communities, scribes who were trained in their craft in different parts of the Jewish world, wrote the Hebrew alphabet differently. And comparison of the script in this book with other dated examples, dated and localized examples of Ashkenazi script tells us that it's consistent with the late 13th, early 14th century in southern Germany. With respect to codicology, codicology means the study of codices. That's where the term comes from. That is to say, books written in the form that you and I are familiar with books nowadays, the type of books that you put on your bookshelf, not the books that you unroll from the ark of a synagogue, or the type of books that you have on a Kindle. Those are also books, but rather the books that you have on a bookshelf are called codices. That is the technical term for them. So when we talk about codicology, we're talking about how are books, this kind of technology for the creation of a stable text, how are books created? What goes into the production of the parchment, the layout of the page, the quires, right? How many sheets of parchment or paper are put together in a gathering that makes up the book? All of that falls under the category of codicology. So when we think about this example in front of us, specifically the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor, there are several hints that point, again, to Germany, southern Germany, of the late 13th slash early 14th century. You can see all three of them on this one page, on this one slide. Number one, you might notice these are actually two consecutive pages of the Mahzor. On the left side is side A of the page, or the recto. On the right side of the screen is the back side of the page, or the verso. Those are the two terms, recto, verso. So this is the same leaf, but you will notice that there is absolutely no distinction in the physical appearance of the parchment itself, right? The shade or hue of the parchment on both the recto and the verso is exactly the same. We call this equalized parchment. That is to say, when animal skin is processed and scraped down such that there is absolutely no distinction, no visual distinction between what would normally be the hair side and the flesh side. And we'll see a contrast in just a moment. The next slide will show you what it means when what it looks like rather when when the parchment has not been equalized, when it has not been scraped down in this fashion. The second characteristic that I'll point out is that the lines of text are ruled, okay? And they're ruled specifically with plummet, that is to say, the precursor to the graphite pencil, right? Lead point. All of these texts that you see on the page are written out exactingly on this straight line that has been ruled with plummet. That is the second codicological feature that I want to point out. And the third one, which is really the hardest to see, but I've put arrows on both the recto page and the verso page to point this out to you, is that both the inner margin and the outer margin of this page have been pricked. Okay, that means that the scribe, when he was laying out, or rather processing the parchment, he added little indentations in the parchment along a straight line down the side, both of the inner margin as well as the outer margin. And the purpose of that was so that he could draw a straight line, right, rule the page exactly across from the left to the right, or the right to the left, however he was doing it. Those three features, again, the equalized parchment, the use of plummet for ruling, as well as pricking in both the inner and outer margins, are all features of German Jewish manuscripts from the latter half of the 13th century and onward. And the earliest dated, if I'm not mistaken, is 1264. From that point on, we see more and more of these German manuscripts, specifically German manuscripts, not Northern French, German manuscripts, that feature all three of these codicological characteristics. I told you before that I would, or I promised you before that I would show you what it means when parchment is not equalized. I think this is a relatively good example. Gila mentioned before that I had the privilege of being involved in the sale of Codex Sassoon, which is now on display at the Anu Museum, as she also mentioned. This is two sides of the same leaf, what you're seeing in front of you, two sides of the same leaf of Codex Sassoon. You can see on the left side is page 223, and the very back of that page, 224, is on the right side. So again, this is one sheet of parchment, that is to say, a piece of animal skin, but there's a very clear visual distinction between the left side, which is sort of cream colored, and the right side, which has this sort of yellowish hue. On the left side, we're looking at the flesh side of the parchment. On the right side, we're looking at the hair side. Okay, so that's what it means when a piece of parchment has not been equalized, okay? And again, when scholars study the production of books, they focus on characteristics, details like this, because it helps them date, for example, for instance, it helps them date these books, but also helps them trace the history of book production in Jewish culture. Now, moving on from there, what is the prayer rite that is represented in the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor? So the answer to that is that we are talking not only generally about an Ashkenazi prayer book, but more specifically a Western Ashkenazi prayer book. And what I mean by that is that in the Middle Ages, we know that already by the beginning of the 14th century, a sharp distinction developed between the prayer rite that Jews used in, let's say, Western Germany, Alsace, so maybe Eastern France nowadays, Switzerland, and then eventually Northern Italy. That was the Western Ashkenazic rite, as opposed to the Eastern Ashkenazic rite, which was used in Central and Eastern Germany, Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Poland, and points further east. That was the distinction that developed. One of the sort of most prominent places in which you see this distinction, and it's just an easy heuristic for people who are trying to identify the prayer rite of a book in front of them, is with the Hotzaat Sefer Torah during the prayer service when the Torah is removed from the Ark. Probably many of you are familiar with the liturgy for that recitation, for that part of the service. It usually starts, as you can see on the right side of the page. This is on the right side of the screen. This is a page from the Nuremberg Mahzor, which is currently owned by David and Yemima Jezelson in Switzerland. And this is page 5R, that is to say 5 recto of the Nuremberg Mahzor. So probably some of you are familiar with the fact that when we take the Torah out of the Ark, we start Ein kamocha ba'elokim Hashem, Ve'en kima'asecha, etc., etc. There's this whole lengthy recitation that occurs. That is characteristic of the Eastern Ashkenazic prayer rite. And in fact, the Nuremberg Mahzor is one of the best exemplars of that prayer rite. As opposed to on the left side of the screen, where we have a page, again, from the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor, where if you look where I've pointed with the arrow, where it says, Umotzi'in Sifrei Torot, right? It says that you remove the Torah scrolls from the Ark. And it doesn't have this whole elaborate recitation. Rather, all it says is, V'yomar gadlu. You just say that one line, gadlu d'Hashem iti, unuram mashmo yachdav, ve'onyan hakal ala kol, etc., etc. It's just one recitation, one specific verse from Psalms that is recited by the prayer leader, and then he brings the Torah scrolls to the bima, to the reading desk for their ritual reading. But that is sort of one very prominent, easy way of distinguishing between Eastern Ashkenaz and Western Ashkenaz. So again, we're talking here in the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor about a Western Ashkenazic mahzor, a mahzor that would have been used in a Jewish community from these regions in Western Europe. Moving on, just to point out, and I think this is fun for people who study the history of Jewish prayer rite, there are two specific practices that I've brought together on this page in order to illustrate sort of some of the unique features of this prayer book. I could have cited many, many other examples, but I think people are familiar or most familiar with these two texts. On the left side of the screen, we have the very end of the Amidah, of the standing statutory prayer. And on the right side, we have a portion of the silent Amidah, the statutory prayer as recited by the individual before the prayer leader repeats the Amidah. So one thing that I think many of you are probably familiar with is that when we end the silent Amidah, again, talking about the left side of the screen, usually we say, Oseh shalom b'imramav, Yaseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. That is how we nowadays generally end our Amidah. But you can see over here that the scribe wrote out a different text. Specifically, it says, as you can see where I pointed the arrow, Shalom bismoli v'shalom bimini v'shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Or maybe you weren't supposed to recite the word amen, that's why it's not vocalized. Whatever the case may be, this is an alternate text. It has virtually the same meaning, right? You say peace to my left side, peace to my right side, peace upon us and all of Israel, amen. But this specific formulation was opposed by a very prominent rabbi of 13th century Germany. His name was Maharam of Rothenburg. He passes away in 1293. And you can see I've quoted for you the text of his student, Shimshon ben Tzadok, who wrote a book called Tashbetz Katan. It's now called Tashbetz Katan, where he cites his teacher, Maharam, opposing this practice. Okay, that's kind of one of the interesting features of this book. It preserves this ancient version of the ending of the Amidah that was later opposed by the Maharam. And I think one of the things this shows us is that this book, this Mahzor, was being produced in an era when the Maharam, who again passes away in 1293, had not yet established some kind of hegemony over all of Ashkenazi practice. There still was the allowance for this variation, at least where the scribe of this mahzor was working. On the right side, moving on to that example, we see here a fascinating vestige, again, of a practice that we don't have nowadays, but this is the practice that apparently was operative in the time of the scribe to recite the priestly blessing, that is to say, the 3 verses with a little prologue or a little preface during the silent Amidah, okay? And that's what you see on the right side of the slide where I've pointed the arrow. It starts out Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Barchinu v'Abracha Mishuleshet, etc., and then it quotes those verses from Numbers that we associate with the priestly benediction. Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, Yashem panav elecha v'yichunecha, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. That is not something that we do nowadays, but again, apparently in the time of this scribe, that was the common practice, at least in his community. And you can see this attested in a collection of minhagim, of customs, that was compiled in the beginning of, or the first half of the 15th century by a fellow named Rabbi Isaac Tirna in Central Europe, in Austria. And he mentions this practice, and it gets quoted in later halachic sources as well. But again, this is just to demonstrate for you that people who are interested in the history of Jewish liturgy have much to learn from this book. There is a lot to be mined from it. And I think it's really a wonderful treasure trove of information about Ashkenazi practice, again, in, let's say, the late 13th, early 14th century. Moving on to the art, which I know is probably of great interest to everyone here. This slide over here gives us some depictions of what the art in this book looks like. Specifically, on the left side of the page, we're talking about the Al-Chet litany that is recited on Yom Kippur when we express regret over our sins. We recite this vidui and beseech God for atonement. And what you can see over here is that the scribe has written out certain parts of this text in either red or green ink, okay, or pigment. This was one method that he used to decorate the text of this book. There's this alternation between red and green. And this palette of black, green, and red gets used throughout the Mahzor. We'll see that on coming slides as well. But one thing that I want to show you on the right side of the screen is that he's also responsible, it seems, the scribe, for the feather-like decorations on some of the letters. So you can see on the right side, there is this alphabetic acrostic where each of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet is written out in red. And the scribe, in order to give more emphasis to the acrostic nature of this poem, has decorated the letters with these wing-like images. We saw that a little bit before where Avraham had decorated his name. Here you see it again. He is using the same motif to draw the reader's attention to the acrostic nature of the text. Now, I think this is significant because of what I'm about to show you, which is who is the one who was responsible? This is really the question. Who was responsible for the artwork? So it's my contention that the scribe, Avraham, was not only responsible for the text itself, but also for the vast majority of the decoration of the text. I could be wrong about this. I'm happy for someone in the audience or elsewhere to disagree with me about this, but my thesis for purposes of this presentation is that Avraham was not only the scribe, but he was a scribe artist. And what you see over here on this slide is what I think is evidence of that, namely the fact that this, on the left side of the slide, there's this enlarged initial word, the word az, b'yom kippur slicha hareta, that is the beginning of a liturgical poem. So in between, interspersed among the letters, are these two grotesques. On the one is a grotesque, one is a dragon. On the right side, you have a dragon. On the left side is an image of some sort of winged creature with a human face, also bearing a Jewish hat. We'll get into that a little bit later, the Judenhut, and this sort of darting tongue. And again, using the same color palette, right? We have both the red and the green, as well as the black for the word itself. But what I want to draw your attention to is that what we call wriggle work, right? That's this sort of decorative motif that gets used around the letters, where the scribe has embellished the letters themselves with these little wing-like images. That's called, for our purposes, we'll call that wriggle work. That wriggle work is superimposed on top of the two figures, or at least one of the two figures on this page. And I think that points to the fact that if someone else would have been responsible for the artwork, we would have expected that he would have come after the scribe. I think what we're seeing here is that the scribe is the person responsible for the artwork. Again, you could argue that perhaps there was a separate artist who came in between the writing of the word as and the addition of the wriggle work. I think that's possible, it's plausible, but I think more likely is that the same person who wrote the letters and added the wriggle work was also responsible for the artwork, specifically for these two, for the dragon and for the grotesque on the left side of the screen. Another interesting thing about this book is that we have a little bit of a hint about how the artist, whether he was Avraham or someone else, but let's say Avraham for our purposes, we have a little bit of a hint of how he did his work. So on the right side, you see the word Shoshan, which means lily or rose, depending on your interpretation. That enlarged word, the incipit, is written out with these little images inside the hollow spaces of the letters. And what the scribe has done, or the artist has done, is he's added pigment surrounding these designs. We call this spared ground technique, which is to say that you add pigment in the background of what you want the artwork to show in the foreground. And that sort of brings it to the fore. That's called spared ground technique. And that's what the scribe or the artist is doing here. He is filling in the empty spaces around the artwork in order to bring them forward, in order to bring the images forward. But you can see that he never got around to finishing his work, right? So we have some of the pigment added in the shin of Shoshan, but it has not been entirely filled in throughout the word. I think this may point to the fact that he either ran out of time or money, or maybe there was some sort of freak accident. We don't really have a good idea of what happened to interfere with his completion of the artwork, but it kind of freezes in time for us and gives us a window into how he was producing the artwork for this book. Moving on. I want to show you some of the wonderful initial word panels, decorated initial word panels that we have in this book. There are 10 of them. We saw one on the previous slide, that was the word Shoshan, but here we have the word Melech. As many of you probably know, one of the central themes of the holiday of Rosh Hashanah is the coronation of God, declaration of his kingship as the supreme sovereign of the world. So here, for example, you have two piyutim, two liturgical poems that start with the word melech, and the lamed, the ascender of the lamed, has a crown motif on top. I think that's a lovely thing. Moving on, we have a couple more of these poems starting with the word melech. Again, with some of the spared ground technique you can see on the right side of the page where they look kind of like dinosaurs almost, or lizards or dragons, something inside the hollow of the letters. And then on the left side, more of those grotesques that we talked about before, with what we call a diaper pattern in the background, this sort of geometric pattern of decoration. Here are two more of those initial word panels, Ana on the right side and then Sare on the left side. One thing that I tried to figure out, I don't have a good explanation yet. I wasn't able to actually make it out, but I think if you look inside the shin and the resh of the word Sare, you will see some lettering there. I assume that's meant to be some sort of inscription. I could be wrong. If anyone has any insight after this presentation and is able to make out what it says there, I would love to know. And then finally, the last of the initial word panels, I think many of us are familiar with the Unetana Tokef passage that's recited on the High Holidays. This is the first word, Unetana, of Unetana Tokef, written out in this beautiful fashion, one of my favorite initial word panels of this book. Moving on, we have some more examples of grotesques. On the left side, this is some sort of lizard or dragon that has the face of a dog and maybe also the paws of a dog or perhaps a lion, something like that. And on the right side, another tailed beast, again, perhaps a dragon, with the face of a man, a bearded man, and again, a darting tongue, a swollen nose, and a Jewish hat. And that is going to bring us into our discussion of some of the art historical aspects of this book, which are really key to understanding the significance of this book. So one really fascinating feature of this book is that it depicts a custom, which, as far as I'm aware, is not practiced nowadays, that the shofar blower stands on a stool or a chair or some sort of raised surface when blowing the shofar. He puts one leg on top of this surface and raises up the shofar and blows. So we know that during the repetition of the Amidah, or maybe even during the Amidah, depending on your custom, there are 3 points at which we blow the shofar. So these 3 parts of the prayer service are all illustrated with this image of the shofar blower. And again, he's doing this strange thing where he's standing on a stool. I'll just point out that on the very far left of the screen, the face of this shofar blower has been replaced with what looks like maybe an animal head, maybe a bird head. It's a little bit unclear exactly, but he's wearing a Jew hat, so we know that he's Jewish, whether he has a human face or not. The middle and right side of the screen have images of men that seem to be wearing talitot, but we don't have any tzitzit. There are no fringes, but it does look like they are wearing a prayer shawl. And then there's sort of in both of those images, there are these structures, these buildings in the background that could be a prayer ark, they could be a synagogue, they could be a city potentially. It's not entirely clear what they are. And then the last thing that I want to draw your attention to is that on the very far right of the screen is another dragon with this foliate tail and foliate tongue, who is maybe either running away from or possibly trying to interfere with the shofar blower. And we are going to talk about that presently. So as many of you probably know, the shofar blowing is the really climax, central ritual feature of the Rosh Hashanah service. And part of the reason for that, not only is it specified in the Bible, but it also in subsequent Jewish thought came to represent the idea of really beseeching God for mercy on a day of judgment and shooing away, driving away any influence of Satan, of any sort of demonic force. And we see this already discussed in the Talmud. There's a passage in Tractate Rosh Hashanah where it says, Lama tokinu mariyin kishein yoshvin, v'tokinu mariyin kishein omdin. That I'm reading from the top of the screen for those who are following along, right? So the Talmud asks, why is it that we have this practice of blowing the shofar both when seated as well as when standing, referring to different parts of the tefillah, of the prayer service? And the answer that's given for why we do this is kedei le'arbev hasatan, in order to mix up, confuse Satan. So that's what you see going on very clearly in the image that I brought for you. This is from what's known as the Kaufmann Mahzor in Budapest, volume 2 of the Mahzor, where again you have this image of a shofar blower who has his right leg on some sort of tripod, and he is raising up his shofar, blowing the shofar, and it seems pretty clear that the Satan on the left, this demonic figure, is trying to run away from the shofar blast. Okay, so this is sort of a visual representation of this idea that was very much present in the minds of Jews in the Middle Ages, that the purpose of the shofar blowing was la'arbev hasatan, to drive away the accusing angel that would potentially prevent the prayers of the congregation and the shofar blast, really, of the congregation from reaching the gates of heaven. And we see this even more explicitly in another mahzor. That's what I have on this slide, where this is from the Vienna Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, where again, pretty clearly you have a shofar blower. This time he's wearing a talit that does have fringes on it. He's putting his right leg on a stool and raising up the shofar, blasting the shofar blasts in the hope that they will drive away what you see on top, the kategor, that is the accusing angel, and will reach the sanegor, the defending angel, on the left side, on those sort of archways, if you will, are meant to represent maybe the gates of heaven, something along those lines. And another thing that I'll point out in this image, it really does a lot for us. On the right side and on the left side, you have these evil creatures, this sort of lion on the right and a dragon on the left. They are probably meant to be visual representations of, again, Satan. So that's what we have going on also in our mahzor, in the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. You'll remember that I drew your attention to the dragon that's sort of camped out behind the shofar blower in that last image that we saw. The same type of theology stands behind that image as what we're seeing over here, namely that the purpose of the shofar blowing is to drive away the Satan. And what I cited for you on the top of this screen is a passage from, again, that same collection of customs that we cited before. Rabbi Isaac Tirna collected much of Ashkenazi practice in Austria in the beginning of the 15th century, and he mentions this practice of standing on the stool. This is the first literary evidence that we have for this practice, but obviously this had been already in use prior to its recording by Rabbi Isaac Tirna, or really I should say, the glosses on his book. It's really from the glosses to Rabbi Isaac Tirna's book. Clearly, from this visual evidence that we've cited, this practice was in use already before the first half of the 15th century, as evidenced by these mahzorim that we've looked at already. So I think one of the interesting things for us is to think about how Jews chose to represent themselves and their customs in these books, and what that can tell us about their belief system and how they conceived of their relationship with the divine, and what the purpose of Jewish ritual and prayer was in this period. Now, one other thing that I want to draw your attention to in the context of the artwork here is that many of the images, not all of them, but many of them do not have human faces in the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. We saw that in the previous slide that I showed you before. We see that, for example, on this slide as well. This is an old Ashkenazi practice, probably going back already to what I'm about to show you, which is a collection of biblical commentaries, now in the library, the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, dated 1233, again from Würzburg, where you can see that there was some hesitation, or a lot of hesitation, about the visual representation of human beings generally, and specifically human faces. So in this image, which is meant to depict the sort of Joseph receiving his father Jacob and his brothers in Egypt, it's at the very beginning of Sefer Shmot, Ve'ele Shmot, the book of Exodus. You can see that none of the figures has facial features, okay? Or if they did originally, they've been scratched out. And the brothers are all wearing Jew hats. Again, we keep on seeing the Jew hat. This is part of again, a theme that we see specifically in Ashkenaz, specifically, let's say, from this period, 1233, into the middle of the 14th century, and perhaps even beyond. There's a very famous Haggadah called the Florsheim Haggadah, where also someone decided to scratch out the faces. Not unique, I guess, to this specific period, but it continues beyond. And this has to do with a concern about the visual representation of human beings. I've cited for you, we're not going to read it in the interest of time, but I've cited for you on the top of the screen some of the relevant literature, at least according to Bezalel Narkis, who is a very famous art historian. He traces perhaps the origins of this practice of removing facial features or distorting the face in some way, or depicting it in profile, or representing the human being with a non-human head. All of this he traces, at least potentially, to a concern about human depiction of human beings. And I think probably many of you are familiar with the famous Bird's Head Haggadah, where we see this very prominently. All of the, at least Jewish figures, or most of the Jewish figures, have had their heads replaced with birds' heads, hence the name Bird's Head Haggadah. This is all part of the same phenomenon, at least potentially. It's called zoocephalic imagery, that is to say, zoo, animal, cephalic, head, where the head has been replaced with a non-human head. Okay, moving on. There is one leaf in this book, specifically leaf number 42, which I think we're safe in asserting was not decorated by our scribe artist, our dear scribe artist, Abraham. And you can see that pretty clearly because of the extensive use of gold and silver leaf on this page. So again, this is the earlier part of the shofar service. Again, a very dramatic part of the prayers on Rosh Hashanah. And if we look at the left side of the screen, this is 42 recto, the initial blessing, Baruch, that has this beautiful gold leaf treatment. Below, there's someone holding a Torah scroll and pointing his finger. He also seems to be wearing a talit on top of his head, as it draped over his head. And then on the left side of this page, there is again a shofar blower with his leg propped on top of a chair and lifting up his shofar blasts to heaven. And then on the verso, the word Zochrenu is also given this special treatment in this initial word panel with gold leaf in the background, and then the four corner pieces of this panel have silver leaf. This is kind of a special treatment that we see. We are running short on time, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit. I want to tell you about how this book moves. This page, I'm not going to read what it says over here, but this page seems to indicate that this book moves to Alsace, We know that because of the reference to on the top, it says Ashkenazim ha'umlamlim. The person who's adding this note is referring to the despicable or miserable Ashkenazim or German Jews. And then that same hand on the bottom part of this slide refers to the Tzorfatim. That's the where I've pointed the arrows. You can see the word Tzorfatim, the Northern French. So this probably was written by someone who was maybe working in a community that had Ashkenazim, but also Frenchmen, so potentially Alsace, that's my theory. Then it moves, as we see on this slide, to the Lake Constance region. So we're talking about sort of in the area of Zurich, sort of northeast of Zurich, where Germany, Austria, and Switzerland meet. There is a lake called Lake Constance, or Bodensee in German. And you can see on the top of the page, there is an explicit reference, Kan mit Konstanz, Omrin, and then it says Adon Ketikaf Moed. That is the title of one of the liturgical poems that they recited in that region. And then on the bottom of the page, I'm pointing out, if you look sort of midway through the third line, there is a reference to a slicha, a penitential prayer called Anihu HaKonen. This was composed in the latter half of the 14th century after the Black Death. So probably what this means is this book moves to Lake Constance potentially in as early as the latter half of the 14th century, perhaps after that, and then eventually it makes its way to Italy. And the reason we know that is because of all of the censorship that we see in this book. So I've brought two visual instances of censorship together on this slide. On the right side, you can see that one strategy that was used to censor potentially sensitive or problematic text, at least from a Christian perspective, was simply to blot out the text with ink. Now, we can read it nowadays because the ink has faded with time, but at the time that this was done, almost certainly it would have been completely illegible. That was one strategy that was used to censor texts that were deemed potentially offensive to the Christian authorities in Italy. On the left side, we see a different strategy. This is the scratching out, literally taking some sort of sharp object, maybe a knife, and scratching off the ink with this knife or other sharp surface. And this is a very famous prayer. Many of you have recited Aleinu L'Shabeach. So probably some of you know that there was in the Middle Ages and continues to be recited nowadays a line in that prayer that says Shehem Mishtachavim Lehavel Varik, that they, the non-Jews, prostrate themselves before vanity and emptiness. Okay, so this was not looked upon favorably, shall we say, by Christians, and so it was struck from this prayer book. Now, one thing that I've proposed in my research on this book is that it may have been done by a Jewish owner himself. I think that some of the evidence for that, for example, can be seen in the fact that it's not done consistently throughout the book. And also some of the prayers have been sort of reproduced, alternate versions have been written on the side. So I think this was probably done at the same time that the text was being censored. It was also being replaced by the same person doing the censorship. That is my theory. I'm happy again to be disproven. You can come up to me in person or over chat, and we can talk about it. But I think this may have been an example of self-censorship where a Jew proactively removed the problematic texts in order to avoid much more drastic measures by a Christian censor. One last thing that I want to show you, and then we're going to wrap it up, is that you can see over here, this is an opening in the Yom Kippur Shacharit morning service. There are many, many piyutim that are written out in this prayer book, many liturgical poems. Two of them are particularly virulent in their rhetoric, in their sort of anti-Christian rhetoric. One of them, the one that's missing from these pages, starts out Hagoyim Efes Vatohu Negdecha Chashuvim. The non-Jews, the Goyim, the nations, considered as nothing before you. So you can already get the sense that this is not leading in a very positive direction, at least for a Christian reader of this book. So what's happened here? You can see this is an opening. What's happened here is that a page has been entirely removed. And you can see that because there's a little stub. If you look down the gutter of the book, that is to say where the pages meet the gutter, there's a stub. So someone completely excised this leaf, the leaf that would have contained this problematic liturgical poem. Again, Hagoyim Efes Vato Negdecha Chashuvim, and just took it out of the book, completely ripped it out or cut it out. But because that leaf also contained the end of the poem on the right side, as well as the end of the poem on the left side, or sorry, contained the end of the poem on the right side of the page, the person who ripped it out had to write over the text that had been removed along with that problematic poem in the bottom margin on the right side, and also in the top margin on the left side. You can see that he scraped out that problematic poem and instead written out the rest of the text of the poem that we see on the right side. That's another strategy of censorship in this book. Now, finally, I want to tell you why we call this book the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. It's after this very famous professor, scholar named Shadal, or Shmuel David Luzzatto, who's a professor at the Rabbinical College of Padua. And he, in addition to studying the Bible and Jewish liturgy and theology and poetry, etc., would also collected many, many important books, both printed books and manuscripts. One of the books that he collected was, in fact, this mahzor, and we see that already in this dated inventory from 1868 that you see on top. It's written out in Hebrew and Italian. This is a reference to our mahzor, to the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor. I'm not going to read it for you. Just trust me for a moment that this is in fact referring to our mahzor. In the middle of the page, I've reproduced the sort of catalog entry from the sales catalog when Luzzatto's collection was sold. Also in 1868, it's written in French. It's basically just a translation of the Italian that you see on top. And then finally, and I'm sorry that I didn't write this out for you, this is an entry from the institution that acquired this book from the sale, namely the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris, where Maurice Schwab in 1904 publishes a catalog of some of the manuscripts and incunabula, early printed books in that collection, and he includes, this is number 24 of that collection. So just to sum up for you, and then we're going to close, I've reproduced a map over here. You can see that the book starts its journey in southern Germany, then moves, I think it's likely, moves to Alsace in sort of eastern France, then downward again to the region of Lake Constance near Zurich. From there, goes down into northern Italy, okay, reaches Padua, where Luzzatto lived and taught, and then from Padua gets sold to Paris, to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, this institution based in Paris. And from Paris, it moves to Sotheby's in 2021. We had the privilege of selling it at auction. It sold for $8.3 million, which was at the time a record for a Judaica manuscript, and remains a record, I think, for an illuminated Judaica manuscript. And it is currently, I'm excited to announce that it is currently part of a very important collection in Columbus belonging to J. and Jeannie Schottenstein, who are wonderful philanthropists and also collectors of Jewish art. And with that, I'm going to bring this presentation to a close with this lovely image of a congregant saying Amen at the very end of the Musaf service. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Yeah, and let's open it up.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And we do have lots of questions. Just even on that last page that you just showed us, you can see there's kind of faded letters. Is that from the page before coming through, or?
That is from, yes, that's right. you're seeing the ink from the other side, from the, I guess, what would be the verso, or sorry, the recto of this leaf. Yes.
Okay. Just some technical questions, and there's lots of little questions as well that I think people would love to have your contact in, if you don't mind asking. There's some very technical questions that came up, but I can only ask the limited amount of questions. So first of all, what is the size and weight of the actual mahzor?
So I admit that I don't recall the weight. It's been a little while since I've carried it myself. Again, we sold it in 2021, but the size is a little bit over a foot tall. I can actually give you the exact measurements if you'll bear with me for a moment. I'll open up my handy dandy catalog. It's 12 and a quarter inches tall and 9 3/8 inches wide. So a rather large book.
Okay, thank you for that. Who decides what goes into the mahzor?
That is an excellent question. I'm sorry that I did not mention that detail before. But generally speaking, again, these were books that were produced for a community, right? For the Chazan to read from during the prayer service. So probably what happened was that the community that commissioned this book would have dictated to the scribe which were the texts that they recited in their specific community, and he would have followed their direction in reproducing the text in the mahzor. Eventually, one of the things that I hope, I didn't dwell on this, but I hope you saw in the course of the presentation, is that as the book moves, the text evolves, right? So each community has its own practice, and the practice had to be adjusted as it moved from one community to the next, including adding, subtracting, etc., the various texts that were being recited.
Thank you for that. Back when you were describing to us the difference between the Western versus Eastern Ashkenaz, there was on one side there was icons on the page, and the other side there wasn't. Is that a stylistic thing, or is it does it have any meaning if you're able to go back to that page at all to see what?
Sure, let's go back to that page. So I think you're referring to this, right? Over here. This was where I was trying to demonstrate the difference between Eastern Ashkenaz on the one hand, on the right side, that's the Nuremberg Mahzor, and Western Ashkenaz with the Luzzatto High Holiday Mahzor.
Yeah, I think there was some little on the right hand side you can see the little letters, and then on the left hand side it's oh sorry, the feathers that are on the left
The
hand.
feathers, yes, yes. Okay, so again, scribes are, in addition to writing out the text, they try to telegraph additional information to the reader when they are reproducing these texts. So one thing that the scribe was trying to do was telling you which were the passages in the Kaddish. That's what you're seeing here on the left side of the screen. This is the Kaddish prayer. So he is emphasizing the beginning of new parts of the recitation of the Kaddish. Yitbarach, V'yishtabach, V'yitpar. Maybe some of you are familiar from your experience in synagogue. The Chazan, the prayer leader, will recite this as a new recitation, new part of the Kaddish prayer. The same goes for Titkabel and Yehei Shmei Rabbah and Oseh Shalom. That's what's going on with the wing-like additions.
Thank you. If you go to page 9 of your presentation, when it was the Unetana Tokef, I think, the
Yes.
Alphabet, it was slide number 9 there.
Yeah.
At the bottom, the letter on the right hand side, the letters that are highlighted, the Shin, Mem, Ayin, Vav, Nun, could that be his name, Shimon?
Thank you so much for asking. Yes, this is a reference, or not a reference, it's highlighting the name of the Paitan, of the author of this liturgical poem.
Okay.
Maybe some of you know that the way that Paitanim, that these liturgical poets would indicate their authorship was by including in the acrostic their name, sometimes more explicitly, sometimes less explicitly. This poet has chosen, Shimon, has chosen to use the last line, the first letters of each of the words in the last line of the poem to sign his name, Shimon.
Okay, thank you. I know this is just a technical question, but you mentioned the term zoocephalic. Could you spell that for us so that we could?
Oh, yes. Absolutely, with pleasure. Everyone got that, zoocephalic? There's a wonderful
Okay.
article, as I mentioned before, by Vital and Narkis about zoocephaly. There's also a study more recently by Joseph Schatzmiller about the issue more generally of concern, reticence on the part of Ashkenazi Jews to depict human figures, which again, if anyone wants to email me, I'll write down my email address for you here. You can email me. I'll be happy to send you a scan of both articles, more articles, whatever would be helpful. I'm very happy to provide the information.
Thank you. I'll probably email you and get that for everybody, and then we can send it in the follow-up email. And are grotesques used in any other religious decorate
Artistic
yeah,
decoration and
yeah.
tradition. Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things that Bezalel Narkis very helpfully discusses in his article. He talks about how this is not limited to German Jews. We find it in Christian art, for example, in depictions of saints. So some of the saints' heads are replaced with animal heads because saints are associated with certain different saints are associated with different animals. So sometimes their heads are replaced with animal heads. This is not exclusive to Jewish culture, but it seems in the Jewish context to reflect a specifically Jewish concern about iconic representation of human form in artwork. That does seem to be specifically Jewish.
Thank you. On slide 13, Roberta wanted to know, is that Shaddai?
Oh, I'm sorry. Over here. It's Sareh. It's the word
Array.
Sareh, which means officers of. Sareh Kodesh Hayom, Ish Bereo Nitachad, keeps on going from there. It is not the name of God.
Okay. Thank you so much for this. I know a lot of people came in late or in the waiting room, and in the follow-up email, we will be sending the full recording. So it's great that you registered, and then you'll be receiving the full recording. Thank you so much, Shaul, for your time.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for the privilege. I hope to meet you all again at a future event. Thank you so much.
Where is the best? One last question. Where is the best place for people to follow current places that are selling Judaica? You're through Sotheby's. Do they have a specific Judaica section that we can follow?
There is a Judaica webpage on the Sotheby's website, which again, I'm happy to send to you, and then you can send it along to the rest of the attendees. There are periodic Judaica sales at Sotheby's, as we were discussing before, usually at least one a year, sometimes two or three, depending on the amount of traffic we get with property. But our upcoming sale, for those of you who like to follow these things, is in December of this year, December 2025. And I would be overjoyed to have you all come through the gallery and show you around the items that we'll be selling then. It would be a great privilege for me to see you and to schmooze with you about the things that we're selling.
Oh, I see Ari making a CSP adventure already. He loves it.
Okay, great.
Thank you
Looking
so
forward.
much.
Thank you very much, Gila, and thank you all for coming. It was really wonderful.